Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and in the Orlando area of Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political commentator Al Spry. We have H.W. Crocker III, no relation to Betty, who's going to talk to us about World War I and the U.S.
The brand new book, The Yanks Are Coming, a military history of the United States in World War I, as we are in the midst of this 100th anniversary of this war to end all wars, or so they called it. If you'll stay put, the Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and in the Orlando area on Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political raconteur Al Spry. It's great to be here with you, Reagan, as always.
Always a pleasure, sir. And a bit of a history lesson today, but before we get to it, obviously, we want to talk for a minute about Tuff TV 38 and some observations on what's going on in the Sunshine State.
Tuff TV 38, of course, is pleased to put us on 3 times a week, and we thank them very much. We are on Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays at 9 a.m. You can watch us over the air with an HD antenna, also in select mobile home parks and apartment complexes on the Channel 69 on the Summit Broadband Cable TV system. If you can't get the programming, I suggest that you get really angry because, you know, Americans like being angry.
Yes.
We revel in it. And you should call your cable system or satellite TV provider and say, I want my DirecTV.
Yeah.
I want my Tuff TV, TUFF TV, and I want it now.
There.
Now,
Okay.
let's go to a poll now that I'm all worked up and angry.
All right.
Because it feels good.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how Rick Scott is at 46%, Charlie Crist at 45%.
And that's a New York Times CBS News poll.
So it is still a dead heat, folks.
Yeah.
This was conducted October 16th to the 23rd, margin of error of 2 percentage points. So, yes, it is still a dead heat. Unfortunately, no love for Libertarian candidate Adrian Wiley, who was not included in the survey. Now, I wonder why, Reagan.
And when it comes to the New York Times and CBS News, well, you have to look at the people who sponsored the poll. They're the ones who said, no, don't include him.
Exactly.
You know,
and so now you have to ask why. Why is it that we always end up with these one party versus another party, and no one ever feels like there's any other choice? Because there really isn't. We have Democrats and Republicans who are basically the same things with, of course, social window dressing. You have to ask, why is there no other voices? Well, the media doesn't want to promote other voices for some reason, which we don't have enough time to go into, Reagan.
No, we could do hours on that. We really can. But, Adrian Wiley is going to have an effect on this election. All the other polls who have included him have put him in there at maintaining about a 7% interest in this.
It's interesting. Yeah, he will be a spoiler one way or another.
Yeah.
But they won't even mention that. Tampa Tribune. This is a Florida story here. Let's go. Conservative columnist Douglas McKinnon, former aide to U.S. Senator Bob Dole, the old hatchet man himself, deciding to write a book about southern states seceding from the Union to form a traditional values country. I always wonder what that would be like, Reagan. What would be a traditional values southern country?
Well, that's a good question.
Obviously, would you say it would be segregation now, segregation forever? Because that was a traditional Southern value.
Boy, it surely was.
Perhaps Jewish people get out, gay people get arrested or get out.
Yeah.
Lots of football. We'll see lots of that. KKK marches, maybe?
Well,
or am I being too extreme? I don't know, but these were very popular values in the South.
They absolutely
in Florida, even today, the KKK was always strongest in the state of Florida.
And they are still around within the last year or so in the St. Cloud area. We've had, and these fellows are yet to go on trial. They still make noise, and not as much as they did, say, 80 or 90 years ago, or even 60 years ago. But they're still here.
They're still here, and I just don't know what a Southern traditional values country would look like. I have a guess, but
Well, I guess he probably wants you to buy the book.
Well, he just lost his gig with the newspaper because of it.
So you better hope that some people buy the book. Really,
I'm sure there'll be a lot of people buying the book.
We'll take a pause along our network line here, and we'll remind you that this is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day, H.W. Crocker III. His brand new book, The Yanks Are Coming, A Military History of the United States in World War I. He'll join us in just a moment. We are back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And as promised, Al, at this point in the program, we are joined by historian H.W. Crocker III. And as I said, the topic of our conversation for the next few minutes is going to be the 100th anniversary of World War I. Mr. Crocker has a brand new book, The Yanks Are Coming. It is a military history of the United States in World War I from our friends at Regnery Publishing, and available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. And H.W., welcome to the Florida Roundtable.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I guess before we get started, as opposed to Al or I sitting here and reading your biography to the audience, go ahead and take the first minute and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I am a native Californian. My family on my mother's side goes back before the gold rush. Actually, sort of helped found San Diego, but grew up in Southern California when it was still Reagan country way back when, and have been educated both there and a little bit in England. And my background is I started off as a newspaper man, but I've been involved in writing books or editing books for most of my working life, with a brief departure for about 4 years writing speeches for a Republican governor in California.
Which governor?
Pete Wilson in his first term.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I quick aside, I always had a fondness for Pete Wilson after he went to the United States Senate, and I thought, as I recall, his career pretty much came to an end because of a problem with cancer.
He had a voice problem.
Yeah.
He announced for president, and then he had to have an operation on his throat, so he couldn't really campaign. But what a great thing about Pete Wilson was he was a former Marine. He was really good on defense issues, and my proudest moment in that during that 4-year period was our reelection campaign against Kathleen Brown, the sister of the current governor, and the former governor, Jerry Brown. And we started off way behind. We were down like 20 or 30 points in the polls, and we ended up going away a huge victor. And it seems shocking to people these days. That was in 1994 to think of California as being such a deep blue state. But we not only took the governor's office, we took one house at the legislature and several statewide offices. California was still a competitive state for a
it was, for many years.
Well, and you had a Republican governor recently, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and it does have a lot of Republicans in California, believe it or not.
Beginning with Ronald Reagan, you went through a whole string of them where the Republicans controlled the governorship for years and years. And I just very quickly, I wanted to say that had Mr. Wilson not had to drop out, I had pretty much made up my mind that year that he was going to be my candidate. So I've always had a great deal of good, healthy respect for Pete Wilson. So,
is he still around, Pete Wilson?
Oh, yeah. He's up at the Hoover Institution, and he works in some boards and things.
All right. Having said all that, World War I, the Yanks are coming. 100 years it's been, but why another history of World War I? And I presume it's tied to the 100th anniversary, but why this book and why now?
Well, at least two reasons. One is that there are a lot of books on World War I coming out for the 100th anniversary, but almost all those books, in fact, all of them, in fact, that I have seen, are focused on Europe. This 100th anniversary is a much bigger deal in Europe. Their losses were much bigger than ours. It's the Veterans Day or November 11th is the Armistice Day. So, I mean, in Europe, in England, I lived in England for a while. Everyone there was a poppy on November 11th. In commemoration of the dead. That's it. It's less a part of the American imagination, but that's the second reason why I wrote the book. I've written lots of military history, and it seems to me, in talking to audiences, that a lot of people know a lot about the Civil War, which I've written a lot about, and they didn't know a lot about World War II because their father or grandfather might have been in it. But World War I is this great link between those two epic struggles that we were involved with. And it's a great story. It is really. I didn't realize this until after I'd written the book. But when the book is written, it gives you a pocket history of the First World War before we get in. It gives you the major battles we were involved with, which took us to the end of the war. But 2/3 of the book is devoted to pocket biographies of American heroes of the war. And this is everyone from some forgotten figures now, like Sergeant York, who rounded up 132 Germans virtually by himself, Eddie Rickenbacker, who was our air ace and had been a race car driver before that, to very familiar names, men like Patton, gained his first command of tanks in the First World War. MacArthur was already a brigadier general, won 7 Silver Stars in the First World War. George Marshall of the Marshall Plan was a officer in the First World War. So was Harry Truman. He was an artillery officer in the First World War. And when you look at these guys' lives, take MacArthur, for example. MacArthur remembered his father had been a general as well. He remembered traveling through the Wild West to cavalry outposts, which he remembered as being very much like those John Ford, John Wayne cavalry movies. And he lived from seeing that, growing up with that as a boy, to fighting in the First World War and, of course, the Second World War, to commanding troops in the atomic age in Korea. Mm-hmm. And that sort of vast expanse of American history. I mean, some of these commanders, men like Pershing. Pershing was the commander-in-chief of the American Expeditionary Forces. Pershing had fought Indians. Pershing fought jihadis, in fact, in the Philippines in the Moro Uprising. Pershing brought to the First World War, which we often think of as this futile slaughter of men jumping out of trenches and running into machine gun bullets. Well, it wasn't that way really for the Americans, partly because of Pershing's training. Pershing insisted that every American infantryman be skilled as a marksman and with bayonet. And when the American troops went into battle, many troops thought of their fighting as like Indian fighting, because it was creeping up in small groups of men against German machine gun nests. And the combat was often hand-to-hand. If you have the book in front of you, you see this painting of this Marine in combat at Belleau Wood. And you see there's this shattered, blown-out forest behind him, and he's planting a bayonet in a poor German's chest. That's what the war was like for the United States in World War I.
The last war where you really see a lot of that hand-to-hand fighting, old war tactics, new weaponry, and I make the argument that we're still fighting the First World War, that the First World War never really ended. Yeah, it never really ended. It just morphed.
It's the war. I mean, the phrase I use in the book is it's the war that made the modern world, and some of its effects are obvious. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia happens during the war. You've got here's a neglected aspect of it, which is that the seeds of the Third Reich. People often say, "Well, Adolf Hitler was a result of the war." Well, maybe, but actually, the seeds of that ideology were already present in the Second Reich, which was the Kaiser's regime, which fought the war. There's a great story of a American biologist, Vernon Kellogg, who, before we got into the war, he's involved in war relief work in Belgium. And he gets to go sit down at dinner at the German command headquarters in Brussels and talk to these German officers who are highly educated. The Germans were the most educated people in Europe. And many of these actually officers have been scientists in their civilian life. So he's talking science and biology with them. And he is appalled, absolutely stunned. He's a pacifist, but he's appalled that these Germans are imbued with this fierce sense of social Darwinism, which justifies brutality It justifies wars of conquest. It justifies all sorts of heinous things. And he actually comes back from this experience and writes a book saying, which is in part, I am not in favor of war, but I am in favor of this war because this hateful ideology must be stopped in its tracks. And the man who writes the introduction to that book is Theodore Roosevelt, whose four sons fight in the war. One of whom, his youngest son, Quentin, is an air ace that is killed. His three remaining sons also fight. All three of those sons survive but are wounded and see action in World War II, in which two of them perish. One of them is the only general to land with the first troops at Normandy and D-Day. So you get that in that span of history. But one last thing on that point, which about the seeds of the Third Reich being in the Second Reich, which is one of Hitler's early political supporters after the war, is Erich Ludendorff. Erich Ludendorff was the second in command of the German army and de facto of Germany proper during the war. And why did he support Hitler? Because what Hitler believed after the First World War was exactly what Erich Ludendorff believed. They had eventually had a falling out, but what Erich Ludendorff believed during the war. He too was a social Darwinist. He too thought Christianity was this weak-kneed problem for Europe. He too believed in Lebensraum in the East, creating this German Empire in the East. So
let's not forget the threat of anti-Semitism. The threat of anti-Semitism throughout all, and of course Hitler learned anti-Semitism in Austria, where he was from, in Vienna, and of course there was that whole thing with Ludendorff, and that is correct. Not only that, we're fighting jihadists today. We're fighting Islamists, and these guys it's all a result of the end of World War I when the Brits carved up the Middle East after the Ottoman Empire fell.
Well, I think there's some lessons we can learn from them. When the Ottoman Empire falls, it's really, it's the British, the French, it's everybody, but the British take the lead here in carving up the Middle East. It's really Winston Churchill and T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence Arabia, who create these countries, including Iraq, along with Palestine, which becomes Israel and Syria and whatnot. But they sort of did it right because these sort of jihadi currents are always present in Islam. But in the interwar years, that area was kept relatively pacified and done so in a very economical way. Lawrence and Churchill quickly cottoned on that the way to do this was to have very small ground troops on, essentially British officers who had Arab legions that they controlled, who would direct RAF, British air power, because they had a jihadi threat in Iraq from Saudi Arabia. And that's how they kept it down. And so I think we could learn. It doesn't take $1 trillion and huge commitments of men to keep these areas under control. If you're clever about it, you can do it economically.
And on that note, I think we need to take a little bit of a pause along the network line here. One of the things I wanted to mention, too, that I learned from your book is that General Pershing is one of the few generals of the upper echelon in all of our history who actually had a law degree that he picked up at the University of Nebraska. And I want to come back to him following this break. But let us remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest is H.W. Crocker. His brand new book, The Yanks Are Coming. It is a military history of the United States participation in World War I. And we'll continue our conversation following these messages. From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area, seen on Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day is H.W. Crocker. He is the author of a brand new book from Regnery History Publishing, The Yanks Are Coming, in which H.W. sets the record straight about our American involvement in the Great War and shaping the modern world. We've talked in our first segment there quite a bit about General Pershing and the jihadist. He had to deal with it in the First World War. And H.W., I think it was a unique and direct way of dealing with jihadists. but one that in this politically correct world of ours today, nobody would dare think of such a thing as Pershing did during the First World War I. I want you to share that story.
Yeah, well, one of the things he did was when he buried slain jihadists with pigs, so that under their own beliefs they faced the prospect of going straight to hell. They didn't inherit any virgins in paradise. But his campaign against the Moro uprising in the Philippines was very interesting because, unlike we talk about the American nation building more recently. There was nation building obviously going on in the Philippines. There was stringing telephone wires and setting up hospitals and paving roads and all that sort of thing. But Pershing had been a student when he fought the Indians, and he made himself a student of the Moros as well. And he didn't try to change them. I mean, he accepted that they practiced slavery, they practiced polygamy, they did all these things, but he tried to turn their culture to his advantage. He knew that they were a warrior race. They were a warrior race so fierce that they would wrap their jihadis, at least among them, would wrap themselves in these bandages and drug themselves up to the extent where you could fire a .38 round at them and it wouldn't stop them, which is why they started issuing our officers .45 caliber pistols to take care of them. But he said, look, these guys are warriors. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set prices on the head of these jihadis among these friendly Moros and tell them to go get them for me. And they did. And they were also impressed because Pershing was one tough customer. They could respect him. And they did that too. Pershing was also very protective of both his own troops and in a way of the Moros. I mean, he crushed those who had to be crushed. But in his tactics in approaching Moro compounds, strongholds, or fortresses or forts, he always left an escape route because he always knew, look, there's going to be women and children, and there's going to be Moros who are really not jihadis. I want them to get away and be able to become our friends later. But those who are hardened bandits, jihadis, troublemakers, they're going to get their just desserts. And he succeeded.
Why did we enter World War I? Obviously, when Wilson was running, he said the slogan was "He kept us out of war." There was an isolationist majority in America until we entered at the very end of World War I. What would you say was the reasons why we got involved in this European conflict?
Wilson was the very last person who would ever want to get involved in a war like this. In fact, he pronounced his neutrality immediately and repeatedly throughout, to the extent that he thought that Americans needed to be neutral in thought, word, and deed. I mean, he said this. I mean, from your pulpits, from your editorial posts, from your newspapers, we have to have complete mental neutrality, which Theodore Roosevelt, who was his constant battler against this, thought, this is outrageous. You're telling us what to think and believe. That's wrong. But Roosevelt said from the get-go that, look, if my presidency is dominated by foreign policy, that'd be great irony because I know nothing about foreign policy. He said in 1916, 2 years into the war, I don't know what this war is about. He, like Obama, our only two professorial presidents, liked to lecture the world, but his ability to lecture the world from a position of presumed moral superiority depended on our being out of the war and being the cool-headed peacemaker. He tried to arrange peace without victory as one of his phrases, which didn't go very far in Europe. His cabinet was stacked with people who were pacifists or near pacifists. His first Secretary of State was a political appointment. It was William Jennings Bryan, who was a virtual pacifist. His first choice for Secretary of War was a Quaker who declined, saying, look, as a Quaker, I really can't be your Secretary of War. But he eventually appointed another near pacifist. His Secretary of Navy was the same. And what finally forced his hand was, a point comes when if like the jihadis today, if someone declares war on you, you're at war whether you want to be or not. And the Germans de facto declared war on the United States. In early 1917, they lifted all restrictions on submarine warfare, which meant that their submarines were going to go after, as they had before, neutral American shipping and sent to the ocean bottom. They had also committed 100 acts of sabotage in the German mainland. Maybe the pièce de résistance was that they sent a diplomatic cable to the Mexican government. This was called the Zimmerman telegram, which invited Mexico to attack the southwestern United States should Germany and the United States come to blows in this war, encouraging the Mexicans to regain the territories they lost in the Mexican-American War. And this was just, this was a provocation too far. Wilson felt compelled at that point that he had to go to war against.
So the Germans were dumb in World War I in basically declaring war on America. In World War II, they were equally as dumb when Hitler declared war on America right after Pearl Harbor. What for people who had waged a fairly effective war in both campaigns, why would they decide to both the Second and Third Reich declare war on America when America in the First World War was neutral, and the Second World War, well, we were still neutral against Germany? Why do you think that is? Is that the social Darwinist aspect again, that they should be able to beat America and all that?
Yeah, well, in the First World War, it was sheer contempt because the American military was only as big, roughly speaking, as Portugal's. And they said, look, Ludendorff actually said this. He said, there's no way, I don't give a darn about America, he said. There's no way they can get here in time, and we're going to win the war right now. They're going to win the war by cutting off American shipping and strangling Britain, which, of course, is this island nation dependent on its empire and its trade. And they came darn close. They launched all these Ludendorff offensives at the same time on land. The French army was, depleted, barely holding its own. The British were shoring them up, but the British, again, dependent on trade, when our first admirals went to London to talk to the British Navy, they were stunned to hear these British admirals saying, look, we're on our last legs here. Unless we can get, unless we can stop these German U-boat attacks, there's tons of shipping to the ocean bottom, we're doomed. We cannot carry on the war. And the Americans, actually, one of the first innovations they made was a convoy system, which helped to break the U-boat stranglehold of Great Britain. And then once we actually enter the war, and we don't really come in as a major force until 1918, but once we enter the war, it is General Hindenburg himself. General Hindenburg was the number one general in the Second Reich, de facto the leader of the Second Reich. The Kaiser was a secondary figure. He said the tide of the war was changed. We lost the war when the American infantry entered the Argonne Forest during the Meuse-Argonne campaign.
And then afterwards, of course, Hitler used the loss of Germany in World War I, of course, the heavy reparations that were enacted against Germany by the rest of the European nations to win his election and bring the Nazis to power.
Well, there's at least 3 points to make on that. One is that ironically, maybe most of the exactions, or many of these actions of the Versailles Treaty, ended up not being enforced on Germany because the Allies themselves, except for the French perhaps, felt guilty about it, and the French weren't strong enough to enforce them themselves. So the Germans ended up paying less in reparations than the French had paid to the Germans at the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871.
But it was still a good campaign slogan.
It was a great campaign slogan. But the other thing was that Pershing, let's give General Pershing credit, he foresaw this. He saw this possibility. And he said, look, if I had only been given another 7 to 10 more days, we could have marched into Germany and utterly convinced them that they had lost this war. This idea that we had been stabbed in the back, we had actually won the war, and our politicians at home surrendered when we were still in a fighting state, that myth would have been punctured. The third thing, though, I think, which is very important, is that whatever happened during the war, after the war, we can never remove from the people themselves their own moral culpability. My book is not at all anti-German. The Germans have a lot going for them. If things had gone differently in the First World War, if the Germans had not invaded Belgium and France, if they'd made this an exclusively Eastern Front war, defending their ally, Austria-Hungary, they might have been morally in the right. They might have been fine. But it was the German people. It was, in fact, against his better judgment, General Hindenburg, the supreme commander in the First World War, who brings Hitler into the leadership of the German government.
HW, hold that thought. We need to take another pause along the network line here. We'll let you come back to that and finish that up in a moment. But I have to remind folks that this is the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And also of Tuff TV, I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest, H.W. Crocker III, will continue in a moment. This is the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks, and in the Orlando area of Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day, H.W. Crocker III. He is the author of The Yanks Are Coming, a military history of the United States in World War I, from our friends at Reagan History Publishing. Available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and Amazon.com, places like that. And H.W., as we had to take a break there, you were about to finish up a thought on Adolf Hitler being brought into the German government between the two world wars. And I want to give you a chance to finish up that thought.
Yeah, I don't think that we should, in the West, beat our breast too much about our victory, making Hitler's election and rise to power inevitable, because it wasn't. It was the German people themselves who did this, and it was General Hindenburg, the supreme commander of German forces during the First World War, who actually, again, against his better judgment, he had pressure on him, who brought Hitler into power as chancellor. Winston Churchill said there was no war that could be so easily prevented as the Second World War. Yeah. And I think he's got pretty good standing to say that, not only because he was the British Prime Minister during most of the Second World War, but during the First World War, he was both, at various times, First Lord of the Admiralty, so Secretary of the Navy, but Churchill also served in the trenches in the First World War as an officer.
I want to ask you this, and I'm sure you can tell me. I have forgotten whether it was Clemenceau or Lloyd George when we got to the negotiations to try to bring this thing to an end at Versailles. One of them said, Wilson has his 14 points. God only had 10.
Right.
We'll see.
Yeah, so, Clemenceau was actually both Lloyd George and Clemenceau were sort of liberal people of skeptical imagination, but both were taken by how messianic Woodrow Wilson was. I mean, and almost overtly so. And when he was arguing in favor of the League of Nations, part of his argument was, why has our Lord Jesus Christ failed to carry through his plan for humanity? It's because he fell behind an institution to enact it. And Clemenceau, was wide-eyed looking around, saying, "How do these men all think? What do they think of Woodrow Wilson criticizing their savior?"
Yeah, Wilson had quite an ego.
Wilson had a tremendous ego, and would not brook opposition. I mean, like many, not to make this too political, but like many liberals, like our president today, he tends to think that those people who oppose him are morally shortchanged, and that his moral superiority should be taken for granted. He shouldn't have to argue his points. He's simply right. And he expected everyone to go along with him. He took not a single Republican with him to the Versailles Peace Conference. And he was himself the only president who ever, up to that time, put himself in that sort of position.
Yeah. H.W., we're coming down to our last couple of minutes here, and I want to give you the opportunity. People pick this book up, give it a good read. What do you want them to take away from it? What is the lesson they need to learn?
Yeah, that's a very good, because that was foremost in my mind. It seems to me in a lot of history books, you read them and then you kind of forget them because it's, one darn thing after another. And it's all these right flanks turning left flanks, and it becomes a sort of mishmash in your head. And that's why I focused in the book so much on the people and on the biographies, because I figure you close this book, you will know who Eddie Rickenbacker was. You will know him as a great immigrant story. Swiss parents, comes as a race car driver, becomes our air ace, this jaunty air ace, then becomes this great airline executive and a great warner against socialist tendencies, starting with FDR. Sergeant York, this mountain sharpshooter who's a pacifist before the war, becomes convinced the war's moral worth, and rounds up 132 Germans as though they're a flock of wayward geese.
Right.
And it's great stories.
There are people that need to be remembered for what they did.
And I sort of wrap this up at the end, and people may have forgotten this, but I'm speaking to you not far from Washington, from Arlington Cemetery, and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier was dedicated after the First World War, and the reflection I sort of end the book with. You just read about all these great American heroes. And I couldn't help but think about, it's a great bit of Americana. It's when you can look at this American culture that shaped these men and think, that was America. And wonder, maybe sadly, or maybe with some renewed conviction, that do we have that America today, or can we restore it? Can we remake this country in a way that would make the Doughboys, the Pattons, the MacArthurs, the Ed Rickenbackers, the George Marshalls, the Teddy Roosevelts and his sons, make them proud.
I want to take a few extra seconds here and just read the concluding lines here, because I think they're very powerful. You ask the question, are we the same people with the same mores, the same ambition, and the same spirit? And you're referring now to the unknown soldier whose tomb is guarded 24/7 to this very day. And you say, if so, he, the unknown soldier, will rest easy. If not, perhaps we should return to study this generation's example, to remember what it was like to live in the time of the Americans. And I think that, H.W., that's a very powerful statement and a marvelous way to end this book. The Yanks Are Coming, A Military History of the United States in World War I. It's from our friends at Regnery History Publishing, available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. It is an outstanding military history of World War I. And H.W., thank you so much for spending all this time with us this day.
Great. My great pleasure. Thank you.
We hope you'll come back and do it again. This is the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. And in the Orlando area, we are seen on Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And if you'll stay put, why, Al and I will be back with a brief closing thought following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area of Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation with H.W. Crocker, Al. I think he's got it exactly right on his focus.
The only thing I disagreed with him on, I didn't have time to go into it with him, was I don't believe that the British carved up the Middle East correctly. I think when you put Kurds and Shiites and Sunnis all in one country, you're only asking for trouble.
And we're still paying for it.
I kind of see, Churchill and some of the other guys, Clemenceau, going, "Oh, boys, let's create this thing called Iraq, and we'll put in a royalty, and no one will get along, and it'll be jolly good fun."
And they'll all drink tea at 4 o'clock
and they didn't understand that there was oil under them there, sand dunes, So that was another thing that they didn't take into consideration. But otherwise, it was a nice book. It was well written. It made some very cogent points. Jeb Bush is in the news again.
He is.
Yes, this is unfortunate because, as you know, I don't like dynastic family political dynasty nonsensical things that people vote because they have name recognition. Jeb did a good job as governor, but I really don't want to see another Bush in the White House, just like I don't want to see another Clinton in the White House.
It's the old right of kings, just because daddy was a good king doesn't mean that the son or the daughter can be either,
Exactly. Now, George W. Bush Sr., or George W. Bush, you could say, was a pretty good president. He wasn't a bad president. I thought he handled the first Gulf War in a pretty smart way.
Yeah.
The son, terrible president, And now, of course, we got another not really great president. So who's next? Another Bush? I don't think so. I'm really scared at that prospect, to tell you the truth. And then let's take a quick look at. Do we have time?
Yeah.
Sex and porn. Chris, according to this article, takes some industry money, and Scott invests. So these guys are trying to be sexy, I guess, Reagan.
Is that what it is?
Scott is up in a new ad that echoes a claim his campaign's been pushing for weeks. Charlie Crist has a war on women because he accepted $90,000 from 3 different Broward companies. And, of course, Scott is on the defensive as well against sex-related allegations. that the social networking company Scott invested in, Que Pasa, was in partnership with Latin Playboy.
Well, just a few more days of suffering through all of these commercials.
And you could say it's suffering.
We will find out, unless it comes down so close that we end up with a repeat of the year 2000, and we certainly don't want to see that. But in any event, we do want to say thank you for your time this day, and we'll see you next week with the Florida Roundtable.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Reagan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Reagan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email reagansmith@fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.